And thank you for having me. Just as Matt had to do a commercial break in his presentation, so will I. I mean, hey, that's part of the joy of being management at the University of Copenhagen. But I would also like to thank you and thank you the department for our great cooperation on not least the computer science economics education, where we actually were able to get 58 students starting this year, the beginning of a beautiful friendship, not only for those students but also for us. I think it's obvious that a lot of the new stuff which is happening out there beyond campus is about the integration between technology and various social science phenomena, and the more we can cooperate of this, the more interesting research topics we can pick, and the more interesting students we can produce. So, and what some of you may not know is that Mads is actually very active in the university as such in promoting computer science and pushing that graph to the right, and we are all very grateful for that. And basically, I could leave you with that, because the point I'm going to make in the lecture to come is that the integration between technology and ways of finding security and doing strategy in order to achieve security is one of the central questions in security policy in the years to come. But I might want to elaborate a little bit on that point. But before I do that, I would like to point to my faculty's strategy for the next year. And as you can see, digitalization is a central part of that. We have a social science data institute which has been doing research using big data methods, and we are going to continue to do that, and we are going to have an increased digitalization of our degree programs. We, of course, educate many future leaders, people who are actually going to be in a leadership position in the public and private sector, and most of them won't end up to be brilliant programmers and won't be able to construct machines and so on, but they should be able to use their knowledge on data to not only to base data on making decisions, but perhaps more importantly, to be able to know when to use data and when to use their common sense. And I think you just have to look around the public sector at the moment, where you might want a little bit less data fascination and a little bit more qualified data use, and that is what we would like to focus on. A part of that effort is also what we call SAM for Public. That is an increased engagement on impact activities to get our knowledge out there and work to solve the problems of the day. SAM for Learning is about reforming our degree programs, reinvesting in continuous and professional educations. Some of you might want to supplement your degree from DIKU with some courses from SAMF, and we will be happy to welcome you. And then we would like to focus on climate issue, an issue which engages our students and staff, and that is something which we would like to do more. I guess that also is a huge digital element of that. So that was the introduction commercial for the social science faculty. I hope to see you all there at some point. And now to why I was actually invited. The title of my talk today is on robots and general decision making in a time of automated security. And as I said in the beginning, what I find fascinating, scaring, and engaging at the moment is the way automation of warfare, of security, is increasingly redefining the way we go about addressing issues as terrorism, war and peace, and so on. But also, and at the same time, how a lot of the enduring ideas of how to engage with security issues seem to remain the same. And this tension between concepts which are not really changing and a lot of technology which is at the center of a lot of the security issues which the Western world is facing at the moment. And the success, the extent to which we can actually produce security in the engagement with new technologies very much depends on our analysis of what the use of robots and automated systems is going to mean, and to what extent all that knowledge on human conflict, which we have learned from the Greeks and onwards, are still relevant, and the extent to which it isn't. And a lot of these questions would remain to be seen on the battlefields of tomorrow, but a few of those questions are something you can address today. So that's basically the ground. I would like to cover the ground between the robots and the generals. And if any of you would care to ask a question while I do so, please interrupt. But otherwise, I'll just keep going. What is important to realize when discussing security policy is that is even more than most other policy fields is defined by events. Obviously, various events are often at the center of political discourse and political action. Parliament will open next week. That is the occasion for doing a lot of politics. Various school children may meet in New York City at the United Nations to discuss climate. That is also an event which have some kind of policy impact. But security policy events are different in the sense that many things happen in a very, very short span, and that these events have huge consequences for the people or places where they happen. So it's intensive events. It's events which take place in a very rather brief span of time, and in order to deal with those events of the moment, you need to have prepared many years in advance. So whether it's Chinese troop massing on the border of Hong Kong, Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, the leader of North Korea watching a missile test, please note the lamp on his desk, which is not connected to anything at all. Whether it's Snowden who suddenly leaks various ways of operation from the National Security Agency in the United States, or it is the Iranians bombing Saudi airfields. It's stuff which happens, stuff which you hear about in the morning news shows, and they suddenly set a new agenda. So that's the nature of security policy. It is defined by events. And in order to deal with those events, what military forces and security forces are normally doing is relying on mass. That is, that you can concentrate troops or police officers or programmers or whatever you need in order to address a security issue at a certain time, at a certain place where a certain security event takes place. And since it is impossible just to get those people equipped and sent to that particular spot of trouble out of nowhere, what characterized military and security forces is that they spend a lot of time on training and building themselves up in order to fight wars they might never fight. So for that reason, military forces and security forces might seem a little bit expensive, because if you're lucky, you're never going to use all that equipment and all those soldiers, but they cost billions nevertheless. So you spend a lot of money on preparing for stuff which might never happen. A little bit like academia, actually. So, when you have held all those training exercises, you've bought all the tanks and the planes and the aircraft carriers, and you have all the troops in position, then you can move in and make a decisive effort at a decisive point. And you will know this from, if you ever go to football matches down the road, that suddenly, whenever Brøndby and FCK is playing, the police need to be there. They need to have a lot of forces placed at the right time to do crowd control in the right way. But if you go down there now, there will be no one at all. So that need to mobilize is central to what military forces like. And it has basically been that way since the Persians and the Spartans faced each other at Thermopylae in classical Greek. But what changed in the beginning of the 20th century was the scale in which this was done. fighting in the First World War on the Western Front between Germany and France and Britain and the United States was basically at a standstill for 3 years after 1914 when fighting started. And as you will all know, most of that war was fought for people dug into trenches, slinging various forms of ordnance against one another, and basically not moving that front line for many years. But at some point, Germans and Brits started experimenting with how to break the opposite side's front. And the Germans realized that if you equipped a number of brave and slightly drunk soldiers with a lot of hand grenades and sent them out there, sneaking into the French or British line, they could actually penetrate quite a long way. The Germans never figured out how to connect those stupid brave people with hand grenades, which they call stormtroops, a term later taken up by other political fractions in Germany, how to combine the stormtroops with regular troops so they could actually invade the other side. The Brits were not that good to the stormtroop thing, but they realized how to combine new technological development, tanks, which actually got their name from the code name, those huge containers with the armored tanks in them, the code name they were given, they were called Mesopotamian water tanks, because the British Army claimed that actually it was just water in those huge crates. But when they opened the crates, they had a new piece of military technology, the tank, which were then sent over the German lines, were able to cut down the wire, and using aircraft, artillery and infantry in a combined way, the British was able to use Mars in new and very effective ways. And basically, military forces has been arranged around those lines ever since. But the way you got a soldier to go over the top, cross no man's land, running after that tank, hoping that it would cover for the German machine guns, and hoping that your own artillery had done their calculations right, so you would not be mowed down by your own grenades. The only way you could basically get people to do that, the only way you could make them serve in the tanks, and the only way you could make them fire the guns, was basically to train them into doing very specific things in a very specific ways. At the time where you introduced this way of fighting wars, you were moving decisively away from having a warrior who were fighting with his own sword and his own spear on his own terms, into having people acting according to an algorithm. You're supposed to do certain things in a certain way all the time in order for this system to work. So after the war, the term robot was used for the first time by a Czech playwright who used a Czech term for slave in a play about the production of what we today would call androids, some kind of bio-techno hybrid, which is not quite a human being, but a produced human being. And as so much of the literature of the post-First World War is, Capek's notion of a robot was basically a way to come to terms with the way the First World War has been fought, and the way thousands upon thousands of young men had been shaped into something which was so close to a machine and so integrated with the machines they were operating that perhaps at times it was hard to tell whether they were actually machines themselves. And most certainly, if you were a colonel in that particular regiment, you would far prefer one of Capek's robots to those unwieldy, annoying human beings you are actually asking to do things which they actually didn't want to. So my point is that the way we have organized modern warfare is basically asking for robots. And we have been spending a lot of time in military forces ever since to try to make soldiers as robot-like as possible. This of course takes on a whole new meaning when actually making those armed forces have become increasingly expensive. This graph shows you years and dollars and the cost the cost per person of people employed by the DoD, the Defense Department in the United States. And this is not in any way something sophisticated. It's basically the defense budget divided by number of people working in the DoD. But crude as it may be, this measurement shows you an important fact, which is that the per capita expenditure for military force in the United States have increased dramatically. And you will see some bumps along the way, and if you know your history, you can point to the Korean War or the Vietnam War or Reagan's military build-up, and you will see it all coming to its own in Bush's war in Afghanistan and Iraq. But the interesting thing about this is not the bumps on the way, the particular wars, but the trend. That the costs of running the US military is increasing, and the cost per person deployed in a particular battlefield is increasing as well. So whereas during the First World War, the whole robot point was that soldiers was basically interchangeable and that they were cheap and that there was a lot of them and you could always call a new cohort up. The point about modern military is that the individual soldier and the individual piece of equipment are so expensive that you can't really dare to use them. If you buy military aircraft at the cost of $60 million a piece, then you better be damn sure that it doesn't fall down. Because at that point, making the reinvestment doesn't really make sense. And the whole point about warfare is, of course, that people occasionally shoot at you, and therefore running a war with that kind of equipment is so damn expensive, so it is nigh impossible. So if you actually want to be able to have those mass effects, you will have to concentrate those police forces and those military forces at the right place at the right time. You are increasingly facing the possibility that you will not be able to do so because you're not able to pay the bill for the reserves you will need to have in place in order to act on the day. So how to solve that particular problem? Well, as robots was the answer during the First World War, robots might be the answer now. So the Americans have been using a lot of money on research into AI and robotics. And of course there are several civilian uses for this, but one of the main investors in AI as well as robotics is the US military. Sometimes a little bit more camouflated than others, but in the final analysis the US taxpayers has been investing heavily in this. The US National Science Foundation concluded in the 2003 report that converging technologies, nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive sciences would result in innovative technologies which could produce robots and other automated systems that could do the most dangerous, the most hazardous missions. And the US National Science Foundation concluded that this rapidly advancing technology will make military valuable humanoid robots feasible on the battlefields by 2015 and as capable, efficient and reliable as human soldiers by 2035. I don't know whether this is true of all writing on robotics, but it is a little bit on the optimistic side. But still, as you will see from the picture below the quote, if you define robots loosely enough, in the sense of machines doing various automated functions which humans used to do, especially in dealing with unexploded bombs, robots has been heavily developed. Also in terms of transport and other areas, military use of robots is advancing very fast. The US Army is revising its operating concepts on the premise that soldiers on the squad level, that would be a 5 to 10 unit of soldiers, will be operating together with robots in the near future. So placing the robot on the battlefield is something which is being researched and something which is moving ahead. And the main reason to do this is to get around the issue of mass and cost. Robots can provide cheap and reliable research. You can otherwise get the effect without getting the mass. And this is basically what military doctrinal development, especially in the United States, but also in the rest of the Western world, has been all about since the end of the Cold War. The ability to use technologies to get more efficient use of the taxpayers' money, to get more bang for the buck. And the term they would like to use here is pop-up warfare, that instead of having those large armies waiting to be engaged, you can use them at the time of a particular need. And that what is important to note in this is that ambition to have more automated military forces is based on the belief that you can somehow program not only robots but also military operations to operate in a certain way. I believe that you can actually map the conflict space, and on the basis of this you can know where to deploy your forces, then you can find the right number of forces, including the robots, and then they can go ahead. So you can basically deny the enemy the ability to know the battle space, but you would know it yourself. This idea of deploying robots is, as you might imagine, something which raises some eyebrows. Is it really so that we would like to leave warfighting to machines? Many people see the use of military drones, especially in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places in the Middle East, as a kind of front runner for military robotics. Actually, these are not robots in the sense that they operate on their own autonomous programming, but are remote-controlled airplanes. But still, the sense that it is not a human fighter pilot who sits in the cockpit and pushes the trigger, but actually someone placed outside Las Vegas in Nevada who is remotely piloting that plane over Yemen or Iraq or Afghanistan, is something which has created a huge political opposition. So Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, have stated that autonomous machine with the power and discretion to select targets and take lives without human involvement are politically unacceptable, morally repugnant, and should be prohibited by international law. The European Parliament had issued a resolution echoing this, and there is a huge grassroots movement arguing for not using military robots. Even a number of well-known AI and robotics researchers have signed a statement saying that they will not work on military robotics or the use of AI for military purposes, which, given the funding structure of much of this, is probably going to be a little bit more difficult than they actually claim. So there is a huge there's a huge debate. What is perhaps interesting, and that's the point about studying military conflict, you always end up being an amateur historian, because surprisingly a lot of stuff of this has always happened previously. And the last time someone tried to ban a new weapon system in this way was actually during the Middle Ages, when Pope Urban II wanted to prevent warriors of that time to use crossbows. As some of you might know, a crossbow is a bow which is operated in a way where it can shoot a very powerful dart, which could actually penetrate the armament of knights. Which of course was one of the main reasons why medieval society was a little bit concerned about this invention, because it kind of circumvented the main point of medieval warfare, which was that noblemen were killing peasants and not the other way around. Also, the fact is that medieval warfare wasn't really all that bloody, at least not if you were a knight. and closely in plate and on the horse and so on. The worst thing which often happened to knights were that they were thrown off the horse, they were taken prisoner, and then they would have to wait a while drinking red wine in some castle while their countrymen was able to find a ransom to pay them out. Those of you who might know Robin Hood would know what I'm talking about. But the point about crossbows was that they was actually killing people, and at a very high rate. So the Pope wanted to ban the damn thing, not for fighting Muslims during the Crusades, of course, but in killing other Christian knights. This should stop. And as some of you might guess, it didn't. And that's the thing with those kind of when you try to ban weapon systems, which people actually really like. There's always a lot of talk and a lot of fancy declarations, but when it comes to the choice on whether you're going to win that particular battle or not, people normally kind of forget the rosy declarations and the Pope and so on, and do what they find best. But still, there's something to learn from this medieval lesson on the crossbows, which is that the crossbows actually turned out to be a dead end in terms of military technology. They were actually hard to operate, and you have to really work hard at the fitness center to be able to use a crossbow. It takes a very long time to load, and if other people are a little bit fast, you will end up loading while you're getting killed, especially if you're fighting those knights on horseback. So it didn't really work. Whereas gunpowder weapons, which were not as lethal as crossbows until well in the 20th century, were much easier to operate, much cheaper to make, and they in the end won out over the crossbows. And in many ways, drones are a little bit the crossbows of our age. It's a weapon system which is basically a lawnmower which can fly and have a missile attached to it. It's not going to be the robots of the future. But the whole discussion about drones is important in the way it points to a new way of making war. In the beginning of the 20th century, Quentin Skinner did a number of tests at his laboratory in Harvard, where he was creating what he called Skinner boxes, which were basically a box in which you have a rat, and then the rat was giving certain punishments and rewards doing various things. And Skinner believed, for some reason, that what he could do to rats, you could do in human society. And this idea of rewards and punishments, an algorithm for how to operate in a modern society, was a very popular way, and to a large extent still is, a way to motivate us to do various things. And in many ways, what drones have created and what a robot future of military conflict will create as well is a military Skinner box. A way to go about warfare, which is not so much about that huge confrontation you would know from medieval times or you would know from the battlefields of the First World War, but the pinprick attacks on specific people and specific places in order for them to do things differently. So when the US is not really invading northern Pakistan, but have constantly drones flying overhead, which will attack a terrorist leader there at an assembly point of guerrillas there, they are basically trying not to invade, not to control, but to influence the behavior of people which they would, in normal circumstances in the old days, have tried to kill outright. So it's a cheap way to do warfare, but it's also a way with huge costs for the civilian populations, which of course is hit much more often than the US military will ever admit, but which is also starting to live a reality where you would have to operate on the assumption that a drone is operating overhead. And at that point you end up in an empathyless military space, where those who are directing violence to the other party cannot really see them in the eye. The crossbowman would be able to see the knight he was shooting at. The drone operator in Nevada will not really be connecting to those people in northern Pakistan that he is bombing. And as General McMaster, a US general who briefly served as Trump's national security advisor, said, if you divorce war from all that is the empathy, the engagement with the enemy, it becomes a targeting exercise. To a certain extent, what the US military has been doing since 9/11 has been building an algorithm for how to engage with terrorists or other people in the global south. A targeting machine which is based on large-scale computing, where each and every clue to where Al-Qaeda or IS operatives are going are being put into the machine. On that basis, you do a raid. That raid produces new intelligence. Then you can send out the drones, and so on and so forth. And the point about that machine is that being a machine, it is not a robot, but it operates by a robot logic. Just like the soldiers of the First World War were not robots, but they operated by a robot logic. So if you're waiting for that military robot with an Austrian accent to enter into our collective consciousness, you have to wait no longer. The point is that those robots are not made, but they are us. It's the way we perceive doing warfare, which is already operating by the algorithm. An interesting point, at one point I talked to a colonel from a Western country who had been part of selecting targets for drones in Afghanistan, that is basically choosing whether that particular person of that particular place should be taken out, should be serviced, as the Air Force calls it, by a drone. And what he clearly saw that was when they did those conferences in the conference room with people sitting around the table discussing the intelligence, a lot fewer attacks were authorized than when they did those meetings on video conference between different locations. Because there were it's more difficult when you sit opposite other people to decide to kill people. If it is somehow mediated by technology, it becomes a little bit easier. And that's not to say they did wrong or right, but it is to say that you get a little bit more trigger happy at the point when it's mediated. And increasingly, military force is mediated in the way human beings engage it, and to the very large extent to which technology is used to further it. So we are at the point where not only is the way we are thinking about war becoming robotic, but we are also inventing robots to be even better robots than ourselves. And if it is so that robots is going to be either in a mental capacity or in a real life material capacity to be an important part of warfare, then there is an all-important question to ask, and that would be the last question, the question I would leave you with. Will you die for a robot? Because that is basically the fundamental question of why a military force or a police force or any other force dealing with security is a force in the first place. Most people do not really like to get shot. Most people do not really like to shoot other people. But all of us will, in the final analysis, accept to be shot at or shoot other people if we do it for a community. In other words, if we do this for the guy standing next to us, we are prepared to do what we in civilian society would never have imagined we would be able to do. There is a certain comradeship, a certain sense of community which defines military force. And there's a lot of complicated psychological explanations for this, but in reality it's very simple. Danger makes people connect in ways they would never otherwise connect. The close proximity to other people in danger means that you connect in ways you wouldn't normally do, and therefore you're willing to do things you wouldn't otherwise do. And that community of warfare is the reason why human beings fight. But if robots are put into the mix, would you actually die for a robot? Yeah.
I think it's obvious that of course people will.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine your house is on fire and your kid is in there. You run into your house and you might die because you're trying to save your kid. Now your kid might have the family dog in the house, so the kid will run into the house to save the family dog.
Exactly.
Some kids will run into the house to save the favorite
Robot.
stuffed animal
Yeah.
or dog or robot.
Exactly.
So I don't think we need to ask this
No.
question.
No,
The
and-
answer is clearly yes.
Yeah. So it's actually not a yes or no question. It's to which degree. And actually, there are instances from Iraq where soldiers have been. I don't think that any soldier has been killed, but someone has been clearly seriously wounded, trying to save some of those mine clearing robots from being knocked out by the enemy. Because you get attached to them, and they give them names and so on. So just your example with dogs and children and the burning house is perfectly valid. And if they're just a little bit more intelligent, a little bit more integrated, then they will be part of the community. And the other reason why we know this, and dogs is a great example again, one of my favorite war memorials, and I have to admit I have a thing with war memorials, but one of my favorite ones is in London, which is a memorial for animals at war. Have any of you seen close to Hyde Park Corner? Next time you're in London, go see. And the point is that for most of human history, animals was an integrated part of warfighting. Dogs are the only ones still left on the battlefield, but horses and elephants and a lot of other animals have been well engaged for a long time. And people sacrificed themselves for them. They were an important part of the warfighting community, and robots are going to serve the same function. What has been a not normal situation has been that ever since the Second World War, we don't really have cavalry anymore, and basically dogs are the only animals left on the battlefield. And perhaps for that reason, we have been more and more focused on making ourselves into robots. The irrational behavior of animals was no longer there, and therefore we have made ourselves more robotic than we would otherwise have been, and therefore it is much easier for us now to introduce robots to fill out that problem of Mars. So robots are the future because it's the past. We have been thinking in terms of warfare and security in robotic terms for a long time. Now technology is catching up with our imagination of what warfare would be like. And as always, when your dreams come true, you might be a little bit concerned on whether that was actually what we wanted. Whether it will not be more easy or at least more convenient to use military forces which are at least partly robotic. And whether, if we keep thinking about war in robotic terms, whether we are also missing the most important point about warfare, that you should only use war and military force when there are some strong values at stake, and not just as part of a security algorithm. Thank you.
Time for questions?
Yeah, Magnus.
Any questions?
An interesting point you made about robots being much cheaper than humans.
Mm-hmm.
In the old days, a war was won because one side lost more humans than the other.
Mm.
What happens when robots are those that fight and we consider those cheap or even disposable? When can you win a war?
Well, yeah. The fact is, of course, that of course, killing is an important part of warfare, but that's not really how you win. You win at the point where the opposite side cannot use its forces anymore, and you can do that by killing all of them, or you can do that by placing them in a situation where they cannot really operate anymore. And doing that, the longer your line is, the more forces you can engage, the more you will be able to engage. So the number will be important. I would guess that for a very long time, human soldiers will remain more reliable and more cheap and more easier to make into robots than machines. But still, if we get at the point where you can produce robots or semi-automatic autonomous systems in a way where they can make a real difference in numbers, then it will surely be the side with the most robots which will win. Which makes another interesting point, or we might decide whether we find it interesting or scary. What would be the easiest way to get rid of a robot army? That would be by using nuclear weapons. And wouldn't it be easier, or at least less stigmatizing, to use nuclear weapons against machines than against the human army? So what might actually happen is that the threshold for using at least tactical nuclear weapons will be lower if the robotics revolution really goes ahead. Please.
I'm sitting with the feeling that you are perhaps biasing the discussion by focusing on how high-tech war and the industrial societies are building up for war.
Yes.
Because I see that terrorists, which are also in some way war fighters, they can find ways that are definitely not that dependent on the high-tech and the robotics. What's your comment on that?
I think that's true, and I think what you see at the moment is kind of divergence between warfare which is very low-tech and warfare which is very high-tech. Which actually sometimes makes it difficult for at least the high-tech army to fight the low-tech because they can't really hit them the way they will. But having said that, a lot of this technology, of course not high-scale robotics, but drones, for instance, are becoming so cheap that even low-end military forces or forces which is not military at all can use them. I mean, in Syria, for instance, there's been a number of instances of the use of drones, in Yemen as well. So as always happens with military technology, the cheaper it gets and the more prevalent it becomes, the less it moves out of the high-end nation-state sphere and into it.
Of course, you're right in that, but still, low-tech war fighters can also make use of very, very destructive.
Certainly, and not to challenge that point at all. That is very true. Yeah.
Thank you.
The last question for now.
The drones and so on are making it much easier for small jurisdictions to operate.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if you go to some place like Somalia, you don't really have a state anymore, you just have cities. And so, with the development of this kind of technology, you can see more and more of these sort of autonomous areas, developing. Does anybody look at that?
Just to get clear what you're actually asking for, the creation of autonomous areas as a consequence of technological development?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, because these cities don't need these big military operations. They have their own military operations, right? So
yeah, so you could basically end up in a situation where because it's robot solved, then you don't need a huge population base in order for it to work. Yeah, but I mean we aren't there at all at this point. And one might speculate whether that is going to happen sometime in the future. I think where this is perhaps happening, or where you can see the beginnings of that trend, is in certain Western societies where the premium of drafting people for the military is getting so high because of lowering population rates. I mean, places like Japan or certain European countries, where actually the question about whether you should increase your armed forces is a matter of macroeconomics. I mean, how many young people can you actually put away from the labor market for a couple of years? And robotics would solve that problem as well.
Okay.
One more, and then I will have to go home to cook dinner.
Yeah.
Well, you carefully avoided the word autonomous. we talked about the crossbow as if it was autonomous.
Yeah, it obviously will.
It obviously is not autonomous.
Yeah.
So why do you compare a crossbow with autonomous weapons? This is just my first point. The second point is that the minute you have something which is autonomous, you have the question, who has the responsibility?
Yeah.
This is a very big question, because is it the one who made the autonomous robot? Is it the parliament who decided it should be made? Is it the general who said, in this situation we can use autonomous robots? It gets very diffuse. And I'm sure very many people would like this responsibility question to be very diffuse.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So that we have to recognize that if you don't have a person involved and saying, okay, go ahead with this drone, then where's the responsibility?
Yeah, there's a number of points there. It's an interesting field of questions. With regards to the crossbow, I think obviously they are not robots, right? But it's a way to create an analogy on the introduction of new military technology, and to the extent to which we're able to ban it. And the crossbow and nuclear weapons and chemical weapons and so on serve as a reminder that banning weapons normally don't work. With regards to the autonomy issue and the ethics involved, I mean, a lot of that is basically not about technology, but about warfare. Warfare is very difficult to regulate, especially combat, and the responsibility of any army, no matter whether it's staffed with robots or not, is exactly as you described. And that is a problem which is as old as war itself. I mean, one might speculate that the problem with programming soldiers and teaching them the Geneva Conventions and making sure that they follow them when they operate is an old one, right? And we have plenty of court cases and so on who testifies that when push comes to shove, many soldiers are not able to follow rules, and many armies end up not really caring all that much about the conventions. But I mean, an autonomous system based on a certain programming, you should be able to program that with the Geneva Conventions, and it should operate after them all the time. So there is actually the possibility that robots would be would easier adhere to the conventions. What the robots won't be able to do, and that's perhaps where the debate is really at, is that they will not have the empathy to either shoot or not shoot at certain issues, and they will not will be able to prosecute them afterwards. Is it the robot who is going to The Hague and face the International Tribunal on War Crimes, or is it the general, or who is actually going to be responsible? But as important as this discussion is, and I think it's hugely important, and this is important in many other instances where we would use automated systems, cars for instance, I think it's also important to realize that discussion is as old as warfare itself. This was great. Thank you very much.